對於突變所造成嘅變異，究竟佢係連續變異啊，定係不連續變異呢？
Tell me why ain't nothing but a heartache。
2021年第11條題目係一條有關於變異嘅寫文長題。題目就講啦，變異對族群嘅延續甚為重要，然後就叫我哋咧討論一下變異係如何喺一個族群入面發生啦，同埋論述一下變異係如何有助族群去應付環境嘅不同狀況，以及環境隨住時間嘅變遷嘅。咁今次啦，又過1、2、3、4，咁我哋又睇翻1、2、3、4，咁我哋又睇翻1、2、3、4，咁我哋又睇翻拆解 essay 嘅3部曲啦。第一部分啦，思考時間有啲咩特定嘅字眼我哋要留意呢？分別有變異啦、族群嘅延續啦、不同嘅環境情況同埋變化啦，同埋最重要嘅呢，就係隨住時間嘅變遷啦。跟住啦，就去到落筆前嘅審題咯。呢條題目呢都非常之直白噶啦，就叫我哋講一講變異係點樣喺一個族群入面發生。咁所以啦，變異嘅來源會係咩呢？遺傳嘅因素啦，我哋就要講下有性繁殖同埋突變啦，同埋環境嘅因素啦。然後啦，就要講下變異嘅重要性啦。咁對於一個族群入面嘅生物，佢哋要應付環境嘅不同情況同埋環境嘅變化，咁究竟有變異又會有啲咩嘅好處呢？而當中呢，我哋都要講翻有關於自然選擇嘅概念。咁有同學就會問啦，咦，梁 Sir，我需唔需要講埋物種嘅形成呢？係唔需要嘅，因為今次嘅題目就係講翻變異係點樣有助於個族群去應付環境嘅不同狀況，以及環境隨時間嘅改變，而唔係走去問你啦，變異咧係點樣導致到一個新嘅物種咧去出現嘅。所以咧你就唔需要花時間去講物種形成咯。然後啦，就去到成條題目嘅作答鷹架啦。咁首先啊，我哋就梗要講下變異嘅來源啦。咁對於有性繁殖嘅部分呢，我哋就講下減數分裂啦、受精作用啦。有關於突變嘅概念呢，我哋就講下佢同新嘅基因型又有啲咩嘅關係啦。跟住就去到環境因素，我哋有翻一啲例子啦。然後啦，就去到變異嘅重要性啦。咁一個族群要應付環境嘅不同狀況，同埋隨住時間嘅變遷呢，其實歸根究底都係4隻字啫，就係適者生存啦。當中又牽涉咗一啲咩嘅概念呢？咁啊，快手 download 翻個短文攻略筆記啦。然後呢，我哋就即刻開波咯。今次嘅題目呢，就係屬於描述同埋解釋嘅類型啦。首先呢，我哋就要描述一下變異嘅來源咯。其實變異嘅成因呢，書本都有直接講到噶啦，譬如有遺傳嘅因素啦，同埋環境嘅因素嘅。由於有遺傳嘅因素啦，自不然我哋就要講下基因變異嘅成因咯。當中有染色體嘅獨立分配啦、互換啦、受精時配子嘅隨機組合啦，同埋突變嘅。好，咁我哋咧就逐一擊破啦。首先咧就睇下有關於有性繁殖所導致到嘅基因變異先。咁啊，經過有性繁殖所產生嘅後代咧，就具有親代遺傳物質嘅混合啦。有性繁殖最關鍵嘅一個步驟咧，就係受精作用。受精作用就係嚟自於兩粒配子嘅結合啦。咁我哋就先去睇下減數細胞分裂當中有冇啲咩步驟都會導致到基因變異咯。首先呢，就係不同嘅染色體組合，佢哋有個獨立分配，就係喺第一次嘅減數分裂嘅中期1啦，一對對嘅同源染色體呢，佢哋就會有一個染色體獨立分配嘅行為啦，從而啦就會導致到我哋嘅配子呢，就有阿爸啦、阿媽啦，佢哋嘅染色體不同類型嘅組合啦。與此同時咧，互換咧亦都會產生咗染色體等位基因嘅新組合嘅。咁啊，有同學都有問到嘅咁究竟啦，互換係幾時發生嘅呢？首先咧，互換就一定係發生於我哋第一次嘅減數分裂嘅，一定係 meiosis one 噶啦。佢喺第一次嘅減數分裂嘅邊一個階段去發生呢？就係 prophase one 前期1啦。因為喺前期1嘅時候咧，同源染色體咧，佢哋就會互相配對，成雙成對咁 pair up，而同一時間咧，佢哋嘅非姊妹染色單體咧就會進行一個互換啦。咁過往都係 MC 啦，同埋長題啦，都講過獨立分配啦，同埋互換嘅。 跟住啦，就去到受精作用咯。由於受精作用係一個隨機嘅過程啦，所產生嘅盒子入面嘅遺傳物質咧，都會有唔同嘅組合嘅。所以呢條題目咧，其實係非常之直白噶咯。頭先我哋講咗3款嘅過程啦，都會導致到基因變異嘅。仲有最後一個啦，就係突變啦。突變啊，我哋有2種啦，一個係基因突變，一個染色體突變啦。咁個定義大家就一定要留意翻啦。咁特別想去講嘅呢，就係突變啦，佢就要喺一個製造配子嘅細胞去發生呢。呢一個先會係遺傳得到落去下一代嘅。以前我哋都有學過嘅，如果個突變咧係發生喺身體細胞嘅話咧，其實係唔會遺傳到落去下一代嘅。而呢個突變咧都會為一個族群咧去提供一個變異嘅來源啦，嗱就產生一啲新嘅特徵啦。咁講完有關於基因變異之後啦，我哋就講下咧環境嘅因素咯。咁原來環境咧都會導致到一隻生物咧會有一個變異嘅出現嘅。咁例如咧，我哋有一對同卵相生嘅孖仔啦，咁但係啦，佢哋所處於嘅環境好唔同喎，一個就好食好住嘅，一個咧就營養不良嘅，咁其實啦都會導致到咧，即使兩個人基因一模一樣，但係咧佢哋嘅表現型咧都係有所分別嘅。講完變異嘅來源，喺我哋講變異嘅重要性之前呢，就有一個題型嘅變奏，就想同大家講一講咯，就係啦。對於突變所造成嘅變異，究竟佢係連續變異啊，定係不連續變異呢？咁我相信呢條題目咧，大家都應該答到嘅。突變所產生嘅變異咧，就係不連續變異咯。因為不連續變異咧，都係由於一個或者多過一個嘅基因咧所去導致嘅。而連續嘅變異咧，係由多個嘅基因所組合而成嘅效果嚟嘅。例如我哋嘅高度啦、體重啦，呢啲連續變異咧就係受多個基因咧所去控制啦。好，然後啦就去到變異嘅重要性咯。首先啊，我哋就要問翻自己，一隻生物要去適應一個環境嘅情況或者環境嘅改變嘅終極目標係乜嘢呢？不外乎就係生存同埋繁殖啦。咁所以記緊翻重要性嘅重要性，直線抽擊咧，你就要講翻啦。為乜嘢啊？為咗族群嘅延續咯。其實題目都已經講咗俾你聽噶啦。但係族群嘅延續想拆翻細嘅就係生存同埋繁殖啫嘛。所以喺呢一部分你就要講得出變異對於一隻生物嘅生存同埋繁殖有咩嘅重要性咯。首先呢，你就要講得翻究竟變異點樣幫到呢隻生物去適應到個環境嘅情況同埋轉變先。咁呢度呢，我就想提翻啦，有關於生態位嘅概念啦。由於一隻生物要生存要繁殖，其實最好嘅情況呢，就係唔好同人爭啦，喺個生境入面有一個獨特嘅地位啦。咁就起碼1、2、3、4，所以變異呢係會導致到生物有一個不同嘅生態位，令到生物開發到唔同類型嘅資源啦，同埋減少到生物之間嘅競爭嘅。其次啦，變異又點樣應付到環境隨住時間嘅變遷，亦即係要我哋講翻自然選擇或者天擇嘅概念啦。咁呢一 part 咧，正正就係書本講晒俾你聽噶啦。一個物種入面嘅不同個體啦，佢哋有變異嘅存在啦。咁由於啦，大家各有不同啊嘛，但係大家啦，亦都有機會要競爭。咁呢個咧就係掙扎求存啦。而如果你係一個具有優勢嘅特徵咧，你就有大啲嘅機會去生存同埋繁衍，呢個就係適者生存啦。咁所以咧，你就要明白啦，相同物種之間都有唔同程度嘅變異嘅，就供自然去選擇。當環境有所改變嘅時候，具有優勢性狀嘅生物咧就可以生存落嚟，同埋繁衍佢哋嘅下一代；而冇優勢性狀嘅生物咧就會被淘汰。呢個就係成條題目嘅關鍵啦，就係族群嘅延續啦。同一個物種入面嘅不同個體，佢哋都有個變異嘅。而家環境改變啦，一部分如果佢有優勢性狀嘅，咪留低咯；佢冇優勢性狀嘅，咪被淘汰咯。但係宏觀啲去睇，呢個物種呢個族群，其實佢哋仍然可以延續落去嘅。呢個就係個重要性啦。咁多位。好，跟住啦就去到1點出發咯。今次嘅題目咧就變異開始，就講2樣嘢，一樣咧就係遺傳因素，另一樣咧就係環境因素啦。先講咗遺傳因素先啦。嗱，呢幅圖咧非常之重要，因為咧佢係包括晒整個有性繁殖嘅概念嘅。減數嘅細胞分裂當中，原來有互換啦，有獨立分配啦。 去到受精作用啦，原來佢哋係一個隨機嘅過程啦，甚至乎突變啦，其實都係顯示到俾你睇嘅。今次咧題目就冇問咁多嘅，下次啦可能就問翻你有關於等位基因嘅概念咯。因為啦突變咧通常嚟講，雖然佢係有害嘅，但係有陣時嘅基因突變咧係可以對隻生物冇乜影響嘅。咁呢個啦就係有關於我哋之前咧都有條題目講過嘅，即使我哋有唔同類型嘅密碼子。但係啦，可能佢哋都係有機會咧，但係咧佢哋都係有機會編譯到同一款嘅氨基酸嘅。咁呢個咧就係遺傳密碼 degenerate 嘅 nature 啦。而另一個嘅概念咧就係有關於等位基因，佢係一對對去出現嘅。如果突變咗之後個等位基因屬於隱性嘅話咧，其實佢仍然係會俾一個正常而顯性嘅等位基因咧所去遮蓋住嘅。咁所以啦，嗰個突變咧都未能夠顯示到出嚟。跟住啦就去到環境因素啦。咁過往咧都有題目佢講過咧，同卵雙生嘅話咧，佢哋係咪一定會同一時間患有癌症呢？定還是都會受到環境因素所影響呢？例如營養啦、運動啦。對於植物嘅話啦，可能係光度啦、溫度啦。然後題目咧就考翻我哋有關於族群嘅延續啦，而當中嘅重要概念就係自然選擇啦。咁書本咧都有唔同類型嘅例子嘅，例如呢個殺蟲水啦，例如嗰啲害蟲咧喺佢呢個物種入面都有唔同類型嘅變異嘅，有一啲咧就有一個強一啲嘅對抗到呢款殺蟲劑嘅特性。咁相比起一啲冇乜抵抗力嘅昆蟲咧，其實佢哋就有大啲嘅機會去生存同埋繁衍啦，而久而久之咧就會導致到啦一啲能夠抵抗到呢款殺蟲劑嘅昆蟲咧，佢哋嗰個族群嘅數量咧就會越嚟越大咯。咁啊因為頂唔順咁啊因為頂唔順個殺蟲劑嘅昆蟲就會死咗啊嘛，佢哋係頂得順嘅未留得低咯。但係啦，有一樣嘢想提翻大家嘅，雖然自然選擇呢個理論係受到科學家廣泛認同啦，但係單靠自然選擇係未能夠解釋到新物種嘅形成嘅，所以咧我哋就要講翻隔離嘅呢個概念啦。過往咧都有物種形成嘅 MC 啦，同埋長題嘅，尤其是係駱駝呢一條啦，有關於個隔離啊，同埋之後咧我哋有條講蝴蝶嘅咧都係一樣噶，同埋之後咧我哋講條蝴蝶咧都係一樣噶。咁所以啦，有關於隔離嘅概念咧，就快手睇翻片，溫一溫書咯。221 Question 11 is an essay writing question about variation. Variations are important to the continuity of a population. Discuss how these variations are brought about within a population and how variation can enable the population to cope with the diverse environmental conditions and environmental changes over time. So let's go through the 3 steps to deal with this essay writing question. First of all, thinking time. Which keywords do you highlight? Variation, continuity of the population, environmental condition and changes, and last but not least, over time. And then the precaution, any focus of this essay. Surely we need to talk about the source of variation, genetic factors, and we need to talk about the sexual reproduction and mutation, and then we need to talk about the environmental factors. Secondly, we need to talk about the importance of the variation. How does the variation enable the population to cope with the environmental changes over time? And then we need to recall the concept of the natural selection. Some students, they ask that do we need to talk about the process of speciation? Not really. Because in this question, it doesn't ask how is a new species formed over time. Therefore, we need to talk about the speciation. And then for the scaffolding, how can we present the ideas in a systematic way? First of all, we need to recall the source of the variation. In the sexual reproduction, we need to talk about the meiosis and the fertilization. And in the mutation, we need to talk about how is it related to the new genotype. And how is it passed to the next generation? Then we need to recall some examples of the environmental factors. And then for the importance of variation, since we need to talk about the natural selection, surely we need to talk about the survival of the fittest. So before we move on to the debriefing, so let's download the essay writing worksheet. So this essay type question is about the description and explanation. First of all, we need to describe the source of the variation, and then we need to explain the importance of the variation. First of all, we need to recall the cause of the variation. Variation in organisms occurs as a result of heredity and or effect of the environment. So we need to talk about the genetic factor and the environmental factor. Let's talk about the genetic variation first. Genetic variation due to the genetic factor occur as a result of the independent assortment of the chromosome at meiosis, crossing over at meiosis, random combination of the gamete during fertilization, and mutations. Let's go through the sexual reproduction topic first. So we need to talk about that sexual reproduction produce offspring with a mix of the genetic material from parents. This diagram is a very useful tool to illustrate all the concepts here. So let's take a look at the meiotic cell division. Different combination at chromosome due to the independent assortment. So you can see that during the meiosis 1 and in the stage of the metaphase 1, so there is the independent assortment of the homologous chromosome, and it leads to different combination of the chromosome in different types of gamete. And for the crossing over, so you can also see that the exchange of the genetic material. This process occurs in the prophase 1 of the meiosis 1. You can refer to the MC question and the long question for the crossing over and the independent assortment. And then for the random combination of the gametes during fertilization. The zygote has different combination of the genetic material due to random fertilization. So you can see that the random fertilization of the gamete each have different genetic makeup, produce different combinations of allele. As a result, individuals with different combination of character are produced. And then we talk about the mutation. So we need to record the two types of mutation, gene mutation and chromosome mutation. And for mutation occurring in the gamete or the gamete producing cells are inheritable. So they provide a source of variation in a population and may give rise to new characters that are favorable in a certain environment. So in the same diagram, you can refer to the mutation here in the sperm producing cells or the ovum producing cells. So you can see that the mutation occurring in the gamete or the gamete producing cells. And apart from the genetic factor, we can also recall the environmental factor with the suitable example for illustration. For example, for the identical twins, but they are brought up in different environment. One is brought up in a well-nourished environment, and the other one is brought up in a poor-nourished environment. So you can realize that although both of them they have the identical genetic composition, they are brought up in a different environment, so they will show different phenotype. So before we move on to the importance of variation, I would like to talk about the possible question variation. Which type of variation, continuous or discontinuous, is more likely to be caused by the mutations, and why? So I think you can answer this question. The answer surely is discontinuous variation. And it is because the discontinuous variation are often the result of the effect of one or a few genes, whereas continuous variation are the result of the combined effect of many genes. Note that the environmental factors affect only the development of the phenotypes but not the genetic material. Therefore, this kind of variation is not inherited. Therefore, this kind of variation is not inheritable. After that, we need to explain the importance of the variation. The critical concept is that we need to recall the ultimate goal of the organisms to adapt the environmental conditions or changes. The ultimate goal is given by the question, the continuity of the population. It means that they need to survive and reproduce. Therefore, we need to recall how does variation help the organism to adapt the environmental conditions and changes. So in this part, I would like to recall the concept of the niche. The niche is the role that an organism plays in its environment, and it refers to the way of the life of an organism in its natural habitat. So in a habitat, each species occupy a special niche. So the variation leads to different niche, allowing the exploration of different resources and reduced competition. So you can think about that if the competition is not that rigorous, so the individuals or the population, they can get their own resources easily. They don't need to compete with each other, so they have higher chance to survive and reproduce. And after that, you need to recall how the variation cope with the environmental changes over time. Therefore, you need to recall the concept of the natural selection. So how is variation so important? Because they provide a range of the variant within the same species for natural selection. When there are environmental changes, organisms with better adapted traits are selected and survive and reproduce. However, the less adapted ones, whereas the less adapted ones are eliminated. You can see that the theory of natural selection suggests that variation exists among individuals within a species, and the individuals compete with one another for limited resources, which is the struggle for survival. The environment changes, individuals with favorable character have a high chance of survival and reproduction, which is the survival of the fittest. So it can help us to explain that why variation is important for the continuity of the population. Let's talk about the curriculum mapping. This question starts from the variation, and then it checks us the concept about the genetic variation and the environmental factor. So let's talk about the genetic factor. Now, this diagram is very useful tool for you to understand the variation during the meiotic cell division, fertilization, and mutation. And this question doesn't ask that much about the allele, but maybe next time it can ask you. Mutations that have an effect on organism are usually harmful. However, most gene mutations have no effect on organism because some mutation may produce a different code for the same amino acid. That's the idea we talked about in previous question. It is the degenerate nature of the genetic code. And why I would like to talk about the allele? Because for the allele exists in pairs in cells. Mutation in one allele may be masked by the normal allele because when the mutated allele, they are recessive alleles, they will be masked by the dominant normal alleles. Effect will be masked by the dominant and normal allele. The environmental factor, you can watch this video to gather the idea that why the identical twins, they will suffer from cancer at different time. Or maybe in the plants, we talk about the light intensity and the temperature. And then the question asks us about the continuity of the population and check us the concept about the natural selection. So you can refer to the textbook. There are some examples. For example, we use the insecticide to kill the insect pests. The insecticide will become less effective over a long period of time. And the reason is that genetic variation exists among the insect pests in their resistance to the insecticide. And when the insecticide is applied, so somehow you need to prove with your textbook. So the non-resistant insect pests, they have lower chance of survival and reproduction. And when the insecticide is used repeatedly, the proportion of the resistant insect pests in the population increases in the subsequent generation. So the insecticide become less effective in killing the insect pests. So it is the example you need to recall in this essay. And one thing I would like to remind is that for the natural selection, this theory is widely accepted by the scientists today, but by itself alone, it cannot explain the process by which new species form. The process of forming new species is called speciation. Therefore, for the natural selection, we need to plus one more concept. It's called isolation. And then to explain the speciation. So you can refer to the MC question and the long question about the camel and also the butterfly to recall the concept of the isolation and speciation.